Hi, welcome back, everyone. So today we're gonna have, since we had such a fun discussion on what makes tests horrible last time, we thought we round this out with all the remaining points that we have left. And there was one major thing that goes wrong quite often, and that is when I see test code in my production code. It's especially things like utilities. There's often like extra constructors and stuff like that, and it makes sense to have some setup for test code and have abstractions for dedicated for test code, and we covered that extensively last week, because you need to treat your test code like your production code, but you do not want to be mixing this in with your production code, in my opinion, because you don't want to deliver it to your run environment, and b, it muddles the API of your production code. It makes it unclear what the primary entry point is of your classes, because you have a secondary entry point that is just there for your test setup, but now it's in your production code. So especially I see this go wrong with constructors, which is understandable, but I really prefer to refactor that so that it can be separated into a separate utility, so that it's clear, like, this is for testing purposes and this is my production API, no matter what abstraction level you're on.
Agree and disagree, and
Nice.
I think it's a little bit about the nuances. So if I have a service or some function, I have absolutely no problem to have another entry point specifically for test to make my code more testable. And here I will probably disagree with you, although usually we need to look in the specific case. But where I will agree with you, it's about the domain objects. The constructors is one example that you have in Java. For me now, I'm working mostly with Kotlin, and there you see you have the defaults. And that's where I am not very happy to have the defaults made to make my tests easier. I'm perfectly fine with making my tests easy and more readable, but I think the purpose of the data classes, in this case in Kotlin, is to convey what is our expectation about our data model. And I don't want to have a default there where I don't expect the defaults, where I expect every production flow to explicitly say something about this.
Yes.
Like,
exactly.
say, currency, I don't want to be defaulting to euro if I expect it everywhere to be specified explicitly.
Yeah.
And here I would prefer to make an extra step and use some builders or some helpers in my test code, preferably, or maybe even in the production, but so that they're separate enough.
Yeah,
but most of the time that will be in the test code. Most of the time it will be.
You're saying for like a service class?
Yes, for service class, I will have a little bit less of the problem here. But at the end, it really goes into question of visibility, because usually the service methods are not called from thousands or from many places. So they are relatively easy to trace. I can look at where my method is used in my test. If I see that it's only in the test, then it's obvious that it's in the test. But it becomes a little bit more tricky with the data object, because the tracing becomes more difficult. Usually you pass the data around, you transform it and so on, so you need to go through the whole chain to really know where what is happening.
But if you have a separate entry point for your tests for your service class, then you lose the guarantee that you're testing your production code, right?
You lose, well, you might be losing, but that depends on how much are you losing. For example, I can have a test, I can have a method that just reads everything from some external folder and processes file one by one. For tests, I don't really want to mess with that folder most of the time. I can just give the file or even the contents of the file for most of the file. If I want, I would like to, I might want to have a dedicated test that goes a little bit more end to end. But if I have many tests, then it would be inconvenient and maybe not very practical. Well, okay, depending how big the chain is, to add those things. I have also often this refactoring if I want to decrease the number of collaborators. So in the production flow, for example, there will be a call that will enrich some data, and then it will call the logic, and maybe it will be the part of one service. But for most of the tests, I will want to test only the logic. I don't want to go into the enrichment phase because I can test that separately probably.
If there is significant variation in the logic of only the parsing of such a file, for example, then I would prefer to introduce an abstraction that does only the parsing of the file through a collaborator.
And I agree that that would be a good point, and most of the time we will do that. But even if we do that, that doesn't mean that you cannot have some kind of aggregating class that calls first parsing, then something else, and you might want to test some things in between, and not necessarily refactor it only for the purposes of what is more convenient for your test. So it can be a driving point. I'm not saying that it's not necessary that it's always just make everything public for tests. It's a hint, but for me personally, it's not a strong hint. It's a hint. It's not a rule where I say no, I will not open this method. Especially when working with legacy systems, because there I don't want from the very beginning to refactor everything to make perfect.
Yeah, okay. In a legacy environment, which I guess is basically all environments.
Most of the time, unless the environment that you have started to write yourself from the very beginning, which is also legacy, but a different type.
It longer than 2 weeks ago.
Yes, something like that. Yes.
So yeah, in legacy environment, I would find it acceptable, but for me, it is a pretty strong signal that there's an abstraction missing.
It would be indeed stronger, now thinking back on my experience, it would be stronger usually in the code bases that are consistently well factored. So in one way, let me put it this one way. So it's not necessarily that the other code base or legacy are necessarily bad, but they often slightly lack that consistency because there are different slightly people, different approaches. Yeah. It's difficult if you make a decision to do something differently, to do everything all together in one big bang differently. So you have different variation, and then you want to be maybe a little bit more relaxed and say, okay, as long as it works, as long as it's good and clear, then we can make.
Yeah, it's definitely true that consistency in a code base trumps perfectionism.
That might be a digression, or maybe for some other, but I hate consistency in the code base.
What, you hate consistency?
Yes, I hate consistency as a goal.
Right.
I like consistency when I have things and consistent because I don't have to think, especially if I know how it's consistent. But if I want to change something, and the goal is to be always consistent, then it's often better to any change because, it might be a good idea, but we do it everywhere and also in this microservice. So if we want to do this, we need to do everywhere. When we have time, that means we will never do that. We will be doing the way we did it once at the very beginning because we don't never have time to change it.
This is a massive digression, and I have many thoughts on this, but maybe we should get back to.
I will put it to my to-do, digress.
Exactly.
Okay, I have some more topics. They're not as acute as the ones we discussed in the first area, maybe slightly less acute than the one you mentioned. But what I often have pain with at the beginning when I'm looking at the code bases is the tests that delete data as a part of their preparation, and especially after they run. So it's obviously not about unit tests because unit tests are ephemeral and input-output. But when we're getting into the domain of integration tests or integrated or even worse, or the full environments on the integrated environments, the tests that prepare the data, end-to-end on environments, the tests that prepare data, do execution, and then they delete the data. That I think is a strong anti-pattern. If you want to delete that, if you want to start with an empty slate with your test, delete the data before the test. Because it's so annoying when you got a test fail, you want to see why all the data is deleted. Have fun. You need to go to the test, modify it so it doesn't delete it, then run, and then see the things. Especially it's annoying on the shared environment. I remember at bol.com when I started to work and we had this culture of doing lots of tests on the environment, shared environments, with this mindset that you are creating something, you run your test, and then you clean up, being very nicely. But in the microservice environments, when you cannot really predict which messages are picked up everywhere, it was such a horrible mess. I would be somewhere downstream receiving lots of messages, going back to get the details and getting 404 every time because someone just deleted the data that they finished the test and that's it. Yeah, I would never. Oh, that was horrible.
Yeah, it's a debuggability nightmare, and it's a what's it called? Tracing nightmare, essentially.
Yeah, on the shared environments, it's absolutely no go. I think I personally prefer to really do the append only data. There is a small merit of having empty data when you're starting tests, but honestly, if you're already with the database, you're not in the realm of unit tests. So probably there are some value to be closer to the reality where you probably will not be working on production with empty databases. You will have some data, and there are techniques and ways how to generate basically different IDs and check the data based on these unique identifiers.
Yeah.
But that might be a little bit of a digression. The most important point for me is please don't delete the data at the end of the test.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that one. But I do feel that quite a lot of data models do require cleanup before the test. Like if you have constraints that there's only a one-to-one mapping between a certain type of message or something like that. I think this is mostly for configuration tables, I guess.
That's a completely different story about the configuration. Here I'm talking about the normal data. With the configuration, yes, you want to have a full control over your configuration.
Yeah.
But that's another also system design problem if you have the configuration and your operational data mixed in the same database and you approach it in the same way. That one I saw a lot also.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, configuration is a different story. But that's already on the system level. And that's actually one of the ways how you notice it very quickly when your configuration data is mixed up with the operational data. If you need to really clean your databases because you want to provide a good configuration.
Yeah. Yeah, and a related thing that I always despise is the pattern will just delete everything before we run a test. For some cases you do have to delete something, but then just specifically delete the things that you need to not be there, because otherwise you're messing with potential other debuggability information.
Well, but here I'm a little bit curious why, because if you're saying that I'm deleting the data, why not to delete everything? Assuming that you don't have configuration in your database. Let's say I have only operational data, or even some configuration, but it's under control. So if you're coming with the point of clean slate, if you're starting to delete the data, why not to delete everything? Like in the ideal world, and I saw some setups like that, they would just wipe out their database in Docker and start a new image. I would not recommend this if you want hundreds of tests for your service. But why not to have a completely empty then?
Well, because what I want to be able to do is run my integration tests either against a ephemeral container or against a local container if I'm investigating things. So
okay, here I agree with you. That's I also have here a little bit grunge. It's really annoying when you want to run a test and just because the setup says just remove everything, if you happen to have a local database, it will be wiped out. Yes, that one I also not appreciating very much. I agree with that.
So then in what context was your earlier point that you want to start with a clean slate?
I thought that you mean about side effects. So I said if you rely on the side effects, that you don't want to rely on the side effects, you know?
Yeah.
You don't want to rely on the side effects. There was some other tests, and you haven't cleaned the data, and that's why you have these new tests running. And that's one of the arguments of people who are saying you should always clean your data. They say otherwise the tests will be potentially dependent on each other, which I don't think is a very strong argument because there are other techniques how to make it. A very simple one: make your test suite to execute your tests randomly every time.
Yes.
Then you will very quickly find
Yeah.
if you have dependencies.
Yeah, and while we're on the subject of data and randomness, how do you feel about random data in tests?
Mixed feelings. Mixed feelings. I played also with this. I think it's good to have random IDs.
Yes.
I like to have to build my tests so they don't depend on a particular hard-coded IDs and they are flexible. They can run in parallel with the same database without deleting of the data. I don't like random. I don't really like random IDs in the value fields, like randomizing same amount of an order and so on, because even though theoretically there was an idea that you can get better tests by just saying I want order quantity be from 0 to what is our maximum, in my experience it doesn't bring you much. But traceability, debuggability becomes much more difficult because you need to find the way, or if you have some assertions starting to fail, you say, okay, I expected an order of this size or that many of the calls and so on. It becomes really difficult to trace it back because you don't know from the test itself how many you had at the beginning, what was your starting point.
Right. Yeah.
So here I have a little bit of I ventured once or twice into complete everything random, and with the boundaries I went back and I only keep it for the IDs to avoid clashes.
I think I'm still on the as long as it's bounded properly and as long as the data is sensible, it might still be a good idea, but I'm not convinced yet that the effort is worth it. And the complexity is worth it. But I think we have a other really fine episode here.
Yes.
I think we had a fairly extensive discussion of what makes a bad test, a little bit on what makes a good test. So I guess next episode will be, why do we write bad tests?
I think it's a very good idea. Yes, let's think, why are we writing, what are the patterns, why we ended up in the test that we don't like,
Yeah,
and what we can do about it.
cool. All right, see you then.